today's theme is the accessibility of e-learning. So we've got some really great content in store for you. We're thoroughly pleased that you're coming along this afternoon. And this is the agenda. So we'll be talking about why e-learning is important right now, what makes e-learning different from other products with accessibility, what e-learning developers should know about accessibility, what e-learning designers should know about accessibility, and what e-learning content authors should know about accessibility. And then we have time at the end for questions that you can put to the team. As I said, please drop your questions into the chat box at any time throughout this afternoon session. Jonathan?
Awesome.
Over to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Yeah, we wanted to start out by talking about why we picked this topic and why we think this is really important at the moment. And we're going to look at a number of different, if you like, people who use e-learning and how things are at the moment. For children, e-learning is maybe what they go to after school, or what parents reach out to when a teacher isn't available. I'm declaring an interest here. I have an 11-year-old son, and this is what he does in his homework most days. So he uses something called Mathletics in his maths homework to make it more interesting. He uses Accelerated Reader to prove that he has read all of the books that he said he's read, to be able to get the number of words added to his score to try and get to 1 million every year. So I don't know if that's what your kids' homework looks like, but it's a key part of normal life in schools these days. The other thing is something that we actually introduced our little boy to in lockdown. So his school in first lockdown, obviously we're off like all of them, but some schools provided, tuition over things like Zoom and Teams and that sort of stuff. His school did, but not being able to see anybody, and he was just missing seeing kids. So we found outschool.com, which is a wonderful American-based website that provides literally kind of like, courses on all sorts of different things. For example, every 7:30 on a Saturday night, he's part of the Ravensclaw Common Room to connect with other Harry Potter maniacs doing quizzes and things. This is normal now. This is what we have arrived at, and it's just going to become more and more, I think. For students, I think actually life is possibly a little more difficult. Thankfully, my nephew, who's at university at the moment, is in year 3. If he was in year 1, I think he would be getting not a great experience. This is part of the experience. These are the headlines that we're all seeing every day. People have gone to university and to sit in their rooms doing e-learning at university. And actually, there is a question as to whether or not students will actually go back to university after Christmas, or whether they'll actually just do all of that e-learning from home. And here's another angle on that, really, which is that some of the American universities immediately jumped straight to virtual learning, and they're charging a premium for it. So this is the reality. This, if they're charging a premium for e-learning rather than face-to-face learning, this needs to be good, and fundamentally it needs to be good for everybody. So when we're looking at adults, e-learning has always been part of onboarding and upskilling in all organizations. You'll have that mandatory e-learning that you really hate when you arrive, because it's normally pretty boring. We're going to look at a lot more interesting e-learning in the next hour. For a lot of people, I mean, this is the way that we used to run a lot of our training. This is Graham and myself actually in Hong Kong and China a couple of years ago. Class-based training, that's what we were doing. That's not what we're doing now. What we're doing now is rather like this. Actually at this very second, Graham can't be with us because he's training people over Zoom. And actually there's a picture there of John doing the same thing. We also have got materials which we're taking and making them available for people to be able to access anytime. So video materials, posters, all of these sorts of things. This is what e-learning looks like at the moment. And the big question then is, are we overlooking accessibility in this? So here's a really interesting article came out of this organization, the Association for Talent Development. So this is not an accessibility organization. This is all about learning. They did a survey, and they found that 26% of organizations weren't doing any accessibility in their e-learning. Now, I haven't been all the way through the report, but this is mostly for companies at this level. But 26% did nothing. On the other side of it, what they found was that if an organization actually did one accessibility consideration in their e-learning, their likelihood of actually delivering better learning to all of their employees went up. So there were real benefits for looking at this from the very positive side. From the other side, if you don't, there can be a lot of legal risk, especially when it comes to your staff. This is a slide that I presented last month when we were talking about workplace inclusion. This is a case brought in 2007 by a friend of mine, Sam Latif. She's blind. She's now head of accessibility at Procter & Gamble. And she was learning to be a project manager. And she couldn't learn or take the exam via the screen reader software that she uses. So really important that if you get this wrong, she sued that company and she won that case. So we have been making e-learning accessible for years. We're really good people to listen to in this area, both as advisors. So we've advised, big companies who are doing e-learning for themselves. We've advised e-learning providers. We've even advised people like the Science Museum who do e-learning online to back up the stuff in the museum, and countries like the state of Qatar. We've also done a lot of e-learning. You'll see this BBC Jam thing at various points in the next hour. That was a huge project that I did at the BBC on e-learning through games, £150 million worth of that. And we've done a lot of really cool e-learning ever since. So hopefully it's going to be really interesting to all of you. What I'm going to do now is hand over to John for the first section, and he's going to look at how you start off with this, the requirements for e-learning.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so we're looking at kind of what makes accessibility in e-learning different. So recently we did a project with a client, and we were looking at the fact that they had lots of different e-learning suppliers. And we found, we do a lot of work on web and app, but what's really struck us when we looked at kind of like the e-learning is there's some quite fundamental differences in some of the challenges around accessibility. There's obviously some high-level aims that we have when we come to e-learning. Customers become learners. We also want to take what was typically task completion on a website to actually a learning success. So it's a really kind of like stepping up the game, if you like, when it comes to e-learning. And also, it's not just a question of just being able to use an e-learning system, it's being able to learn successfully from it. So some really important high-level aims. And in terms of accessibility, there are some challenges there, not least around the kind of requirement for adjustments. So we obviously need to be aware of people with disabilities and their needs for accessible products. But in terms of e-learning, we also need to support different learning styles. And that is often something that has some real challenges that we'll touch on as we have a look at some of a little bit later in the session. And also the difference in curriculum. Different people, different needs need to be taught in slightly different ways. You need to consider those needs about how you provide the information. And one of the most challenging areas is around often with a lot of people that produce e-learning sites, is they're quite different in style and kind of interactivity. Very rarely do you find a standardized way of doing it compared to a typical corporate website where things are pretty much based on templates. So one of the challenges we have is how do we ensure that accessibility, but allowing for differences across the kind of learning styles and the different interactions. So that's some of the challenges. So the question is, how do you best address that? So we would recommend a strategic approach. So obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of coding and design and kind of like content, but we need to step back initially and look at, okay, what do we really need to get right? What we need to be aware of when we're building e-learning systems. So it's thinking about the audience, it's thinking about the key task we're asking to do. It's things like specifying the accessibility requirements of individuals and also thinking about the design approach. Now, there's quite a lot there to get right. And the kind of the approach that we kind of we use and we'd recommend people to use is based on the latest best practice when it comes to accessibility. So it's not the kind of like the easiest title to say, but ISO 30071-1 is a new standard which has come out last year, which is very much about making any application, whether it's e-learning, whether it's a kind of app or whatever, accessible. And it's very much based on the principle of kind of strategy, thinking about the strategy first, and then applying that through the kind of the process of building your applications. It's based on a previous standard called the BS 8878, that some of you might be familiar with, but it does contain expertise from around the world. So what we're talking about here is really the cutting edge in terms of how to approach and deal with accessibility. Now, in terms of kind of e-learning products themselves, what I'm going to do is take some of the key concepts out of there and just touch on them briefly as we go through. So obviously really important is, what is the purpose of the e-learning? Now, one of the things that this new standard talks about is the quality or level of accessibility. And the reality is, obviously, a lot of websites go for technical accessibility, which is great foundation. But the reality is, we need with e-learning to move beyond that so that we can take effective and efficient kind of approach. And then ideally, going towards an enjoyable, satisfying experience, which tends to be what you would want to have in an e-learning kind of application. So there's a lot of kind of consideration there. What are you trying to get with? And obviously the foundation of getting the standards right, but e-learning requires more to be truly successful. So that's something really important to bear in mind. And then there's the consideration about, sorry, the target audience. Think about the needs of the different type of audiences. As Jonathan's already mentioned, obviously you're going to have potentially children with and without support. You're going to have maybe people in the corporate environment, and then you have a range of other people. You might have older kind of people looking to kind of learn new skills online. Each of these groups have slightly different requirements when it comes to accessibility. And the reality is, you can't necessarily dictate exactly what kind of technology they're using. They might be using modern desktops, laptops, great, or they might be having to use, particularly some children might have access to older laptops that don't have the sophistication of other tools. And then it might be mobile. So increasingly, learning is available on mobile devices, and that brings a unique set of requirements when it comes to accessibility. And then there's the kind of technology. Now, in the old days, Flash was pretty much what was often created, was used for creating e-commerce. That had a lot of challenges. That's kind of being phased out. And that's something that means that there's a lot of legacy systems in that have its own unique challenges. There is new technology, new approaches with HTML5, for example, and they are, the good news is with that, it can be much more accessible, but you might not have a choice with that. You might have to be choosing an e-learning authoring tool from a range of suppliers. So you need to think about what they are providing in terms of accessibility features and tools. So again, these are key questions that need to be asked at the starting point before you actually kind of starting to build the project. And then who's going to build it? Are you going to have in-house expertise to be able to build it? Do you have to outsource it to a digital agency? Now, the reality with digital agency is there's a lot of great practice out there, but there's also some that don't know as much as they think they do about accessibility. So there's some real challenges to pick a good supplier, and you need to ask the right questions and make sure you cover yourselves off legally. So that's a really important thing. You might have an off-the-shelf solution. Great. But a lot of them don't have accessibility features that are turned on. You need to make sure that they're available. They might have some things that you need to kind of work with or customize, but it might take some time. So there's lots of considerations around how you create, as well as kind of the other aspects of who it's for and the kind of technology you're using. I'm just going to pass over to Jonathan for the moment, because he's now going to kind of just briefly outline his experience from a case study from the BBC.
Thanks, John. So yeah, the BBC Jam project. This is kind of quite a long time ago now. This was 2005 to 2007, and it was a huge project to try and create e-learning for kids all over the country. It was a £150 million project, and there were about 100 different subjects of e-learning that were created from it. And what was great about the project was that whilst we had 25 internal production teams and 25 external suppliers, we sorted all of the accessibility requirements with those suppliers day one. And we did that because a few years previously, I had been involved with, as I said, a very early iteration of the BBC Jobs website. I was editor of Standards and Guidelines, and they called me up and said, you know, we're going live with our new website tomorrow. You know, can you come and check it? And I was kind of like, well, okay, you know, and we looked at it and it was awful. And it was not created by the BBC. It was actually an external supplier who had then subcontracted it to another one. And it became really, really difficult to get them to fix stuff that they got wrong. John, if you can move on to the next slide. So what was the difference between those two cases? One where things just got awfully wrong with one supplier, and one where we actually did possibly the most difficult accessibility e-learning to get right with 25 suppliers. The difference was we were really, really clear about what it was we wanted from accessibility and e-learning right from day one. So that's the thing, making sure that if you're asking somebody else to create this e-learning for you, that you are defining exactly what accessibility and accessible e-learning is to you. And you're going to see a number of elements of that as we go through the next few parts of today. So thanks, John. If you want to, as I say, yeah, so that's the strategic bit. We're going to look at design, coding, and content creation next. So I think it's over to you now, Rob.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So I'm going to talk to you now about what makes coding, accessibility, and e-learning different from other digital products. So I was thinking, how do I bring this to life? And what we're going to do, I've got a little bit of a challenge for you here. So I've been asked in the next 10 minutes to review this wireframe for an e-learning page. And what I want you guys to do is to, in the chat, there's no wrong answers here, just any accessibility issues you think could occur looking at this page here. And then the second page is a little pop-up that comes on when you click on that plus button there. So just as a challenge, of any e-learning you've done in the previously, or anything specific you can call out here, just pop it in the chat and let's see if you can find the same issues that I'm going to go through now. So I've identified 10 different issues that I would feed back on if somebody presented this page to me. And this is for before it gets handed to a designer or even developer to start building, this is what we need to take into consideration. So having tested a lot of e-learning this year, the first thing I would flag is, okay, let's have a skip to content link here. As you're moving through pages, lots and lots of different pages as you go, I've found it quite tiring when testing with just a keyboard. Adding a skip link in would be a nice, simple way of making the navigation better. Okay, the second issue I would flag here is, okay, this looks like it's the page title. Great, okay, that's going to describe the purpose of the page. Make sure the developer codes that as level 1 heading, an H1. And then you can flag that as you move through the content, add in headings in a logical fashion as you go. Third thing, we have some video content here. So often big organizations, in my experience, will have a video player that is standard for all of these. They don't tend to chop and change and create bespoke video players. So doing the hard work at the beginning to make sure that player is properly accessible, it's keyboard accessible. You can toggle captions on and off, audio descriptions, etc. Doing that hard work at the beginning really pays off when you're rolling something like that across multiple different languages, different markets. Here, I would also flag that we're missing a link to download a transcript, another really important way for people to access the content. Okay, I'd also be flagging keyboard accessibility of everything that can receive focus. And tying in with that, a lot of the times I've seen that we have different sort of graphics and images, and sometimes the focus outline as you're moving between bits of content can actually be lost. So it's something for the developer to definitely be aware of there, and make sure that every single different type of element, you clearly understand where you are. It receives keyboard focus, and you can see clearly where you are there. So this is a thing you see across, well, I've certainly seen across a lot of e-learning, where you're unlocking content as you go. So to get through to the next page, you have to do a certain number of actions, and understanding how potentially a keyboard and screen reader should be able to interact with locked content. Question I would have is, should it receive keyboard focus? There'd be two ways of doing this. One, it could be completely ignored, or the second one can actually receive focus and then announce as dimmed or disabled, unavailable. I would go for the latter. What that does is it enables a screen reader user to create a sort of mental model of what this page looks like, how it's structured, how the different elements. So I can see here, I've got 3 bits of locked content that I'm going to have to unlock before I'm going to be able to move on. Another big issue I've come across is labeling of controls. You can visually here, you can see that with the tick, I've completed this. This is done. With the plus sign, that shows that I'm to do, and then obviously I have content that's locked. But making sure that everything has an accessible label, so it can be programmatically announced to a screen reader, is really, really important. The little plus icon here would be a button, and that should actually tell a screen reader that it's going to open a new modal overlay. That becomes really useful to know how you're navigating around the screen. Another thing I'd flag is being able to increase the size of your fonts within the actual browser itself. So setting the font size to large or largest, and then the e-learning actually, as you go through each individual page, it remembers your settings. You don't have to continually keep doing it again. I've had a little bit pushback from this from some suppliers, saying that why don't they just use Zoom? So I'm still believe that it's better to set your preferences within the browser and respect that as you go. One thing I have come across is how questions are grouped. So here we have 3 radio button options. So as a developer, you want to make sure that you're grouping these answers together, and actually the label as well is read out when somebody lands on one of the radio button options. Often one of the differences here is that the answers don't often look like radio buttons, but they act in the same way. So they've been styled in such a way that it doesn't look like a radio button option, but the principle is the same. So applying that underlying structure is really important. We have a submit button that only appears when you actually have completed all the different elements on the page, and then the submit button appears. That will avoid somebody being able to move on before having answered all the questions. I would flag this, that's okay, but we need to tell people that how that's going to interact. That then becomes much more useful to them. The final thing here to talk about is this overlay here. So if this is not coded correctly, this can end up blocking some people. What you want to make sure here is that when it opens up, the focus moves inside there. So probably to the header in this case. And then when the focus does land in there, you're actually trapped between the close button and the header. So you can't actually move out of there and move into the content behind. It's a very common issue that we see, that people tabbing through an overlay, they then end up back in the middle of the page and can get very, very confusing. Obviously, yeah, we have a header there, which we've discussed before, and then a close button to close that and land the focus back in to where you started in the first place. So that's basically how I would approach looking at that page, that e-learning page there, and that would be some of my initial feedback. And when I'm feeding back to teams, I often try and make the feedback balanced. As an accessibility professional, you're often feeding back bad news, but I try and balance when there is things that are being done well, or potential where you can add, such as adding video content, which is great for some people. So keeping the feedback as balanced as it can be, I find is useful. I think I'm handing back over now to John.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for that. Really helpful. So some of the kind of points that Rob's touched on, I'll kind of also touch on from a slightly different perspective. So I'm looking at some brief aspects of design. So I'm just obviously not fully comprehensive. I'm just going to be touching on some key things to consider from a design point of view. I think one of the really most important things, and often gets lost when it comes to accessibility, is stepping back and thinking holistically about the whole process rather than individual elements or screens or pages. The reality is what we want to achieve is a learning experience where people can go from the very beginning through to the successful end and be able to kind of have completed an e-learning experience. So what we talk about, particularly in the kind of strategic approach from like the ISO standard I mentioned earlier, it's very much about thinking about what is critical and what is secondary, and always identify what's critical so you can ensure that you focus as much attention on that as possible. Stepping in, so logging in, access to the system, reviewing content in various players, the interactions, like the quizzes and the kind of like drag and drop, those kind of things. And also anything that comes out from the learning, certificates, emails, all of these need to be considered from an accessibility point of view. And all of them have key design requirements as part of that process. So that is often not always looked at in a kind of joined up way. And that is something we'd always encourage, is that kind of holistic view will save a lot of challenges when it comes to accessibility issues. Now, looking at something a little bit more detailed, some of the key points to consider. So thinking about e-learning packages compared to a standard web page, there's often a lot more ways in terms of interacting and navigating. So one of the challenges when it comes to kind of e-learning is to ensure that you think about how you're going to make these interactions accessible. So you might, for example, have hotspots. So hotspots or thumbnails, progress bars, and you might even have video which has hotspots in there. all of these need to be thought through in terms of access for the various users' needs. So, for example, how can you ensure that it's keyboard accessible? How can you ensure someone that can't see the screen, a screen reader user, has access to this interaction, these content? And if you think about it and step back from a human point of view, the users, it's much easier to think these things through from a design perspective. Often what gets missed is things like keyboard interactions, thinking about someone that can't see, how they'll be able to interact with these different elements. Often design is very much focused on the visual. Also need to step back and think about the reality is different people are going to approach these in different ways. And that's a really important consideration around, particularly on e-learning packages. Now, it's fine to have a totally different way of navigating, but you need to make sure it's accessible and it's used consistently through an application. Because one of the key concepts with accessibility is consistency, but the reality is e-learning, you need to be creative, you need to do things differently, but you can do both of those things if you apply the principles through your application. Now, most of you will have kind of be familiar with drag and drop. Now, a lot of accessibility has been around, okay, keyboard use. How do you drag and drop keyboard elements here? Now, there are solutions to that, but the kind of thing that people don't necessarily think about and step back and think about is, what about someone that has a vision impairment? They might magnify the screen, change the font size. How's the experience for them when they start to interact? So for example, in the first example here, relatively straightforward if you increase the text size, because you've got the line of text that you can kind of think about and drop that in. So not so bad. But second example, for example, much more challenging. So thinking about how you would drag and drop if you were magnifying the screen, a lot of scrolling, a lot of moving around, a lot of challenges in being able to work out what you're doing. So at the very least, it'll impact on the amount of time it takes for someone to do. But we're not saying don't use these kind of interactions. It's just thinking about, okay, how is it going to work for this kind of person that uses magnification, someone that can't see, someone that's using the keyboard. Thinking about that range of needs is really important. And it needs to be creative sometimes. How can you address some of these kind of interactions? Another key thing, now it's always been touched on about text size. Unfortunately, within e-learning, there are some real challenges around text because often you're stuck with a particular kind of SCORM environment where you can't change the size very well, and there's limitations. Now, the reality is a lot of people want to change text size. So you need to think about how you can make that happen and think through. Now, there's common things that happen with e-commerce, e-learning, lots of different sites on mobiles, on desktop. When someone tries to go and resize the text, these kind of things happen. So you might have buttons that get squished, you lose the top and the bottom. You might have things where important content gets cut out because it won't fit into that particular window. So from a design point of view, you need to think about the scenario. What happens to our design if someone increases the text size 200%, 300%, 400%? What kind of experience are they going to have when they get there? So you might have rollover effects where the page is legible, but suddenly you click on something, bang, and it's unexpected. So there are some real challenges when it comes to kind of particularly text sizing. So, it's relatively straightforward on the web normally with responsive design, but in SCORM environments, it is much more challenging. So this is always something I would talk to developers, designers about, is thinking through how can you ensure that this text resizing has been thought through so it's not as an afterthought and is going to cause you, challenges down the line. So a lot of work being done on mobile apps will probably be relevant, and there's a lot of good practice, but it's still very early. So this is a challenging area that does require a lot more consideration in e-commerce, particularly if you've got packages that people can use on mobile devices. And the last point I just want to touch on is personalisation. Now, this is uniquely something that is well known within kind of e-learning packages, and it's a great opportunity to enhance accessibility. Unfortunately, there are kind of examples of great practice, but a lot of websites, a lot of kind of like e-learning packages don't follow this through. So back in the days, early days of BBC Jam, where Jonathan was running the team, first introduction of e-learning preferences as a standard. It's things like being able to offer this within e-learning. So changing the text size, the colors, the font size are great opportunities to allow people to customize their experience. More recently, you're starting to see things like profile selection. So for example, here we have the option to have a default, but then if you have dyslexia, for example, you can change the background, you can turn off text, or, turn off background that has text over it. So you just have the text, not the background. Someone that's blind, you can make sure that audio description is provided. So this might be beyond what a lot of organizations can do right now, but it's important to think about these kind of customization and personalization options. And a lot of these considerations early on will make a big difference to improve the experience and the accessibility of kind of your kind of e-learning packages. So some really important things. That's not, obviously haven't covered everything, but these are some key things a lot of the majority of e-learning packages need to address to enhance their accessibility. So I think hand back over to Jonathan now, talking about accessible content.
That's great. Thanks, John. Yeah, so the final section on content. How does accessible content, if you like, differ from web content? Can we just take over all of the things that we normally do from the web? Well, here's the first thing that I wanted to kind of talk about on this. So the phrase multimedia is almost quaint now. I remember when it came out in the 90s, when it was like, oh, we can do video and animations and things. And, you know, it was a big thing and people tried out all sorts of stuff. I think the great thing about multimedia is that it's very, very good for what we were talking about earlier in terms of learning styles. So different people like to learn in different ways. Here's a number of different ways of learning about volcanoes, which is something my little boy really, really gets. So, you know, over here we've got, this is an animation. So it takes you through all of the stages of eruption and all of the things that are happening. Some people like just text. That's the best way of doing things for them. Other people want to watch a video of it actually happening in a real place. Others maybe want to see a lot of information put together in a kind of bite-sized format. You may even want to do a game. All of these possibilities are ways of enabling people to learn in a way that suits their style. The problem is, what we find these days is that it tends to be single media. You know, it tends to be that people swap from one to the other one. You know, that we used to do everything with kind of just loads of text, but now it's all loads of video. What we'll find here, if we look at the different preferences of people with disabilities, is that different people like different things. And so it's a good idea to actually enable people to get the learning in different ways. I'll give you some examples for each of these. So people who are dyslexic or have a learning difficulty really don't like text so much. And they learn a lot more quickly if you can actually demonstrate things to them. So animations and things like that, especially where an animation is almost like a video, but where you've taken away all of the complexity. You know, the cartoon format, if you like, of the animation is a really helpful thing to get rid of all the stuff that doesn't matter, like the sky and everything else. It's a really great way of focusing the learner on what's important. Now, people who are blind, well, they're listening to their screen readers all of the time, so everything is coming at them in text. So actually, it might be better for them to have an experience where the learning is text, because at least their screen reader can handle that very well. Some people who are autistic also prefer text compared to lots of images and things. They like turning images off if they're provided. A lot of people who have a learning difficulty or dyslexic, as I say, they might like those videos. And actually, most people would love video. That's why YouTube exists. The problem is videos are actually really difficult for people who are blind. You know, what's going on in the video? You know, I know something's erupting, but I can't see it all. So you need to explain what's going on. Obviously, for people with hearing impairments, you need to make sure the captions are there as well. Learners, oh, sorry, that should say ADHD at the bottom there. You know, learners with ADHD want to have bite-sized information a lot of the time. And actually, I think there's a lot more work that can be done in the accessibility community to really understand the needs of people with ADHD, because I still think we're on our way. And then the last one, games, something that I've done a huge amount of that's really, really engaging. They're especially good for, as I say, people who like the experiential stuff of how to do things. And so especially for people with learning difficulties. On the other hand, they're very, very hard to make accessible for people who are blind. I've done audio games and these sorts of things for people who are blind, but they are, quite unusual in the market. It's also the case that for anybody with a motor difficulty, so Toby, for example, uses Dragon to control a computer. Well, for people who have difficulty with their hands, actually you can make games work, but sometimes the way you control those games might be slower than if you can just use the trackpad or the arrow keys. So you need to make sure that games are playable by everybody. Just gives you an idea. Different people learn in different ways, and what we want is, if you like, accessibility, to open that up to a much wider audience, so that people who are, if you like, just not thinking about all of these things, stop doing single media and start doing multi. And here is something that, back from right at the start of my time at the BBC, we were doing the hardest thing there, which was learning via games, and trying to make games accessible to everybody was really, really challenging. So one of the things that we came to was this idea that the important thing was the learning outcomes. So why are you going to this product? What are you trying to learn? There are probably sort of like 5 or 10 key things that you need to learn. Those are the learning outcomes that you want that person to get from using this e-learning. So that's the thing that needs to be accessible, not necessarily all of the individual activities, because it could be different people want to use different routes to get there. So what we found was that the needs of some groups of users could vary massively from other ones. Most kids want to play a game to do something, but someone who's blind, actually, it's just not going to work for them. So what do? Do we just say nobody gets to play a game, or do we need to do alternatives? That's a great thing, but what we found was that it's not really inclusive. So inclusion as an idea in education has been, if you like, quite controversial over time. Do you have kids with disabilities in the same schools as everyone else, or do you put them in specialist schools who really understand how to get the best from them? There are benefits from both sides, but if you like, the key thing is that if everyone can be using the same thing, then everybody at least feels included and no one feels, if you like, excluded. So where you do alternative ways of getting to places, it's a good idea to include all of the fun in there. And here's an example from my time at the BBC. I hope they've changed since then, but actually the learning at the BBC for staff went down this route, which was that everything was becoming more and more interesting and immersive narrative. Someone mentioned Black Mirror Bandersnatch or in the questions, that sort of thing, branching narratives, video-based stuff, incredible things. And if you were blind, you got a Word document. That was the alternative. I don't think that's an alternative. That might get across the learning, but everyone else is having a whale of a time, and the people who are blind are just getting something utterly boring. I think we can do better than that. So it's actually saying, when you do alternatives, how do you make sure that you don't do an alternative for the whole thing, but actually you try and make that, if you like, alternative path as short as possible. And what we used to do, and what I've done for various different e-learning systems, since then, is to put together, if you like, what we term an accessibility map of it. So these are core requirements. So these are the most important things for people to learn. We've got non-core requirements at the bottom there. But for each of those requirements, each of those learning outcomes, how do people with various different disabilities actually get there to success? That's the key thing. They don't have to all be the same way. but they all have to get there in a supported way. So some other things that kind of come out of e-learning and I think are really helpful for people who are used to accessibility on the web. There are a lot of people who I would term the people that WCAG forgot. WCAG was created by a team of people who had a big representation on behalf of people who were blind. And had very few people in the room who were representing the needs of people who were neurodiverse. So people with learning difficulties or autism or dyslexia, all of these sorts of things. When you go into the e-learning world, everything switches over. So these things are actually more important and they think less, in my experience at least, of people who are blind, mostly because most people who are blind lose their sight later in life. They're not born with it. There's not that many blind kids in the country. So things like symbols to help people understand language, glossaries to explain what terms that are not familiar are. These are key things that in most e-learning that actually could be everywhere. And also this is emotional hints for people who are autistic about how they should be feeling about the sorts of things that they're looking at. These are actually something created by an AI tool from IBM called the Content Clarifier that we've been playing with. But it just gives you an idea that there's a lot more than just kind of blind people and screen readers. So just a few hints and tips, and we're going to come to some questions soon. I've got about 3 that I've noted down so far, but if you've got more questions, please pop them into the chat. So just a few hints and tips on content. First one, is the text at the right reading age for your audience? WCAG put it in AAA at WCAG 2.0, so everyone forgot it. But it's really important to get your text right, because a lot of the time that's what people are reading. But the fundamental, the thing that, if you like, tied WCAG up in knots was the complexity of text. So it should be right for the reading age of your audience. And obviously that's going to be different from kids, A-level students, professionals, or whatever. There are tools to help work out what the reading age of the text you've put into a product are. And so you can use those just to check to see whether or not you've got it right. Click the round button, you know, this sort of stuff. Instructions about how to use e-learning are there oftentimes, but some people can't understand which button is the round button. Say if you're blind, you won't get that at all. So you only put that in there if actually you're doing e-learning where the point is shapes and round and all of that. So in general, don't use shape alone, size alone, or the location of buttons in instructions. We've mentioned captions and audio description in video in e-learning already. Here's one. Some people forget that some bits of video are actually animations. This is an animated GIF of somebody with a tremor trying to use a keyboard. I can't turn that off. That has no stop button because it's an animated GIF. In fact, the only way I can turn it off is to move to the next slide where it isn't there. So if you're including anything like this, a lot of people who are neurodiverse find animations like this really distracting if they're trying to read the text up here. So if you include things like that, you need to find a way of having a pause. And finally, if it's part of the learning to actually support the user's content creation, if they actually want to create something with the learning, not just consume it, then you should support that. Here's an example of some of the stuff we were doing at the Beeb. For children who are deaf, they learn written English and British Sign Language at the same time. So reading for them is understanding the links between those two things. We created this action book, which was effectively clickable subtitles here that controlled the video to play the British Sign Language. Writing, how do you do writing when it's a performed language? It doesn't exist written down. We created avatars that you could program to sign at each other. these are the sorts of things that you can get to with this stuff. And we wanted to kind of expand it a long way away from that kind of boring mandatory e-learning that you probably experienced at the start of your working life, wherever you are. So it just gives you an idea of some of the things that you can go to in terms of content. It doesn't have to be dull.